I'm sure you've seen that this week there's a new Superman movie out from director James Gunn, writer too. It's gotten a lot of press. I saw it this afternoon despite my totally giving up the theatrical viewing experience for home theater. I got out and supported this one because Superman has always meant a lot to me throughout my life. As a young lad, I taught myself to read with comics and would come home from school and watch the George Reeves TV series. Thus, he's been pretty much part of my life as long as I've been a conscious person. The only time that those kinds of characters have not been a part of my life was in my late teen years when I was involved with a couple of harrowing relationships, and I let them go because they somehow were not able to they could defeat all kinds of bad guys on the page, but they couldn't defeat the pain that I was feeling. And then one day, alone in Seattle, having just been dumped, I just happened to walk into a comic book store and bought as many as I could afford to buy from that period that I had not been buying. And then I sat on a bench and just started to read until I could figure out, with the help of my friends and my folks, how to get the hell out of Seattle and back to New Jersey. And it was like I had come home to something that had been missing me, and I had been missing it. I know that a lot of it is trite and trashy, but it's part of who I am. Most new Superman stories when I was growing up were pretty bad, actually. Speaking of trite and trashy, the batting average on all these things is much higher nowadays. DC had just given up on trying to make them good or interesting, maybe in the same way that decades earlier Walt Disney, having made Mickey Mouse his corporate mascot, found that he could no longer allow any characterization that would make him fun to watch. I think in DC's case it was less that than lethargy. At that time, that publishing company was owned by Kinney, the parking lot people. And yes, if you've been around long enough, you might have parked your car at a Kinney lot outside the old Yankee Stadium. Kinney later bought Warner Brothers at a time when movie studios were distressed assets due to the rise of television, and subsequently spun those two companies off as Warner Communications, which, without going into the whole history, leads to Time Warner and then the ill-conceived merger with AOL, and ultimately further ill-conceived mergers, which I won't get into at the moment. I should disclose that when DC Comics was still headquartered in New York, I got to be up in their offices maybe a half dozen times. I was working with an editor there. I did sell a story momentarily that was killed. I don't think the editor in question ever read beyond the first page of my script, did not like literally my first paragraph, and then said, I'll get back to you on it, and gave the story to someone else. And I've been an editor for a long time, and I've been pretty mad at people who have disappointed me with a story at times, but I've never done that. I've always done them the courtesy of actually reading the damn thing to make sure that it was salvageable. But this guy, before he threw the story away, would say, yeah, come in on Tuesday at 10 o'clock and we'll go over it together. And then I would come in Tuesday at 10 o'clock and he would not have come into work that day. And he did that to me more than once. And that is my only bitterness where this industry is concerned. But so on one hand, it was still kind of cool because this is something I had loved since I was a kid. And I would go into New York, which for me is a commitment of about 2 hours at minimum, just to get up and get there. And then I'd go to their office and I'd go to the lobby front desk and say, I'm here to see so-and-so. And they would buzz me up to their floor or floors. And they had this waiting room that was themed like a rooftop in Gotham City with the bat signal shining and this kind of crepuscular atmosphere. And I would sit there. And then he would never come for me. But at least I got to wander about the hallways a little bit and look at the decor in that way. And I would think, how cool is it that I'm here? And how lame is it that I'm about to be kicked out because I came for no reason? But I was talking about the quality of Superman comics when I first got into reading them in the 1970s and up through a reinvention about 1986, they weren't the strongest thing, and I just find it very easy to believe that the parking lot people were not very motivated to check in on the creative quality of the books. And that did not change even after the first two Christopher Reeve movies were great big hits. Still, between what good there was then and those two movies, I got what was essential about the character. He's a stranger here, but primarily he's one of us. He's a humanist. The loss of his people in his infancy makes him all the more sensitive to losing any of us. Like Spider-Man, he embodies the idea that with great power comes great responsibility, but unlike Peter Parker, he's not motivated by guilt, but by the belief that if you have the ability to help out, you do, and he has the most ability to help out of anyone. And consciously or not, he very much exemplifies the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, the betterment or perfection or fixing of the world. In prayer, it is to fix it. In the second Reeve movie, General Zod, the bad guy, argues that Superman's weakness is that he cares about humanity. And I suppose it is a weakness if you're looking to defeat him or exploit him, but it's also the aspect of the character that makes him different from other vigilantes who have been invented in the years since Superman first appeared in 1938. What's fascinating about superheroes is, and the James Gunn film tries to address this a little bit, is that in a way they're fascist wish fulfillment. That's what Batman is. If the justice system doesn't work, I'm going to go take matters into my own hands. Screw legality. But what often gets lost about Batman is that, as Denny O'Neil once wrote, I think in the 70s, he has the compassion of a Buddha, but the relentlessness of a shark, and they play up the latter while forgetting the former. Ultimately, Batman is someone who doesn't want to have what happened to him happen to other people. And there's a whole continuity to these characters that might span, say, Superman on the leftmost side of the spectrum and Marvel's Punisher on the far right side, which is just, you're a criminal? Okay, I'm going to put a bullet in your brain. It has always been an explicit part of Superman's character, except for in one misbegotten Zack Snyder movie that he does not kill. And in our debauched world, that's supposed to make him insufficiently edgy, but it's actually the center of his appeal. And if you can't tell a story that includes that, well, one, you shouldn't be telling a Superman story. It's not for you. And in fact, you aren't telling a Superman story. It may look like Superman, but it's not Superman. And hey, all things aren't for all people. Would you hire a director who wanted to set a Tarzan film in a sewer? It might be a good story. It's just not a Tarzan story. Lord Greystoke, king of the sewer. I wish I could do that Johnny Weissmuller cry now, except that he's being sort of drowned at the same time. One other point about Superman Essentials before I get to the baseball of all this. This isn't exactly canon about Superman, but whereas it's very hard to hurt him, he's not insensible to pain. I think everything that's been depicted about the character over the years in a variety of media, including the Gunn picture, is consistent with that. He's very hard to damage, but he can be hurt. And thus, when he's knocked down and gets up again, it represents a truly heroic effort to overcome his own suffering so he can assuage ours. And that quality, combined with his characterization as someone who tries to see the best in people, differentiates him from the Christ figure he's sometimes depicted as being, both in the Christopher Reeve film, when Marlon Brando talks about giving Earth his only son, and in the 2006 Bryan Singer film, Superman Returns, which was not the worst take on the character I've ever seen, but also far from the best, and it contains a long sequence in which Kevin Spacey, of all people, as Lex Luthor, just kicks the hell out of him. And you're supposed to read that, I think, or view it as being similar to the scourging of the Christ. And again, I'm not indicting the Jesus story, which is its own thing, any more than I am a Punisher story or Death Wish, same kind of fascist gratification. Not that I'm making a direct comparison between the life of the Christ and the films of Charles Bronson, or for that matter, Mel Gibson, Lethal Weapon. I'm just trying to say that Superman is a very imperfect or inapt Jesus metaphor. Superman is distinct from that. He's not taking on our suffering because he perseveres in spite of it and eventually through it. And the point is not to do it for us or because of us. He does it with us because he sees the best in the people he meets. And yeah, Superman would die for you, but he wouldn't die for your sins because he doesn't believe you've done anything that deserves that kind of penalty or needs that kind of remedy. And that even if you are kind of heinous, if you have the will to better yourself, you can. That's another message that shows up towards the end of the Gunn picture. No spoilers necessary. This idea that Superman would rather you improve yourself than he just take care of things for you in whatever sense is very strongly embodied in a book written by Grant Morrison and drawn by Frank Quitely called All-Star Superman, from, I don't know, over 10 years ago now. And there's a scene in it that's been reproduced all over the place online, in which a distraught young woman is about to take her life by jumping from a high floor, and suddenly Superman is behind her, and he tells her, "You're much stronger than you think you are. Trust me." And she turns and cries into his chest. And I'm not really doing it justice. It's a banal statement, but it's elevated because of who is saying it, an authority on being strong. And if he thinks you're strong, you must be. Or to put it another way, and I think someone did somewhere, you may not believe in Superman, but Superman believes in you. Again, a theme that's really drawn out in this new movie, and I recommend it on that basis. Simultaneously, as the film comes out, and James Gunn reminds people that Superman is an immigrant, it is worth remembering that he was created by two young Jewish men from Cleveland, with their first attempt coming when they were 18, 19 years old, during the interwar period, but after Hitler and his gang started running around Europe and claiming that they were the Supermen. Little short guy, brown-haired from Austria, says only blonde guys from Germany have the right to rule humanity. You're familiar with the irony. Superman wasn't a pure reaction to that, and there was a whole lot of borrowing. There was a lot of science fiction already out there, like Doc Samson, the pulp character, and Philip Wiley's novel Gladiator, not to mention the circus strongmen who inspired the character's initial look. There was also the feeling of helplessness induced by the Great Depression. The idea of just fixing things must have had a lot of appeal, and we know it did have a lot of appeal to people. Again, thus there was a fascist movement in the United States. And even though I'm saying that there's a spectrum of characters from empathetic to fascistic, and I decry fascism particularly as a system of government, one of the myths about the Nazis is that they were hyper efficient, but that's a pure lie. They were, if anything, the opposite. But there is a place for stories as outlets. As with so many things, there's a difference between being entertained by an idea and experiencing it vicariously through fiction in whatever media and going out and doing that thing. If there were real people like, say, John Wick or Liam Neeson in the Taken movies, or there was one with Bob Odenkirk a couple of years ago that wasn't bad that I think they're making a sequel to, characters whose essential function is to simply kill everybody they see, or going back a ways to about 5 movies, a cop like Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry. Dirty Harry gets you George Floyd and other kinds of injustices of that nature, were he to exist in the real world, I mean. And similarly, characters who just kill with impunity, were they real, would be people you wouldn't want in your town because you might just go to Burger King and they might blow a bunch of people away, including you, for whatever reason. As fiction, though, they're fine. It's just that Superman is a fantasy on the other end of that spectrum. And to the extent that it inspires anyone, it's a more benign fantasy. What I'm trying to point out here is that it's also difficult to wrench him free of the contradictions inherent in his creation, some of which spring from the time of his creation. So as you know, Superman first appeared, as I said earlier, in Action Comics #1, cover dated June 1938. Comic books at that time packed in a lot of value for a dime. They were more like omnibus magazines than vehicles for one story of one character, and thus Action #1 was 68 pages and contained not only Superman but a bunch of other stuff, some with characters who lasted for a while, and some who flamed out pretty quickly. That's entertainment. You throw a lot of stuff against the wall. It also contained some purely factual distractions, including a filler page on the actors Fred Astaire, Constance Bennett, and the comedy team of Wheeler and Woolsey. Perhaps by coincidence, perhaps not, Woolsey was about 4 months from meeting his end at the age of 50. Now, this feature was drawn by Shelley Moldoff, who was a very young man at that time. He would turn out to be the longest surviving contributor to that historic magazine, which is ironic because a lot of the people he drew in that filler feature, like Woolsey, came to a sudden stop, either permanently or in their career. In that first issue, he drew a sports page, which informed readers that Lou Gehrig, last of the famous Yankees murderers row of 1927, was still going strong. Like Woolsey, not actually true, and that if Babe Ruth, by then safely retired, had received all of his walks in one go, he would have had to walk up and down the Empire State Building 70 times. Also that Reds pitcher Lee Grissom was really eager to start both ends of a doubleheader. Grissom's arm was just about over at that moment. He had thrown 223 and 2/3 innings in 1937, going 12-17 while somehow leading the league in shutouts, but he was never able to pitch more than 153 and 2/3 innings again. And today, if he's remembered at all, it's because he appears in a semi-famous baseball photo or semi-historic baseball photo. When Crosley Field in Cincinnati was flooded, a story I've told on this show, he and Reds traveling secretary John McDonald rode over the left field wall, across the outfield, and out to where they thought the pitcher's mound was. And if you look it up, you'll see Grissom sitting in a boat, waving his hat as he floats about the infield. I don't know if it was the rowing that did him in, but I do know at that moment he surely was not up to starting both ends of a double header. In short, appearing in a Moldoff fact-based cartoon in Action Comics #1, Kiss of Death. In the second issue, Moldoff hit Lefty Gomez, who, coincidentally or not, would never again pitch 200 innings after that year. Moldoff's caption on his drawing of Lefty begins, "Lefty Vernon Gomez may be a nervous and jumpy person, but when he's on, well, he wasn't on very often after that." In subsequent installments, Moldoff hit Jimmy Fox, Freddie Lindstrom, Mel Ott, and somehow, in the non-sports version of the page, Leon Trotsky and Walt Disney at the same time. He did Casey Stengel and Ducky Medwick. The former was managing the Braves, which went very poorly, and the other was about to be traded to the Dodgers, and that too went very poorly, with Medwick being nearly killed by a pitch and, coincidentally or not, performing poorly, a story I told in an earlier episode. I can't give you captions for that page because I don't know if it's ever been republished. I don't own a copy of Action Comics #16, September 1939, that's where it appeared, and I'm a little afraid to look up what it goes for, but if anyone can afford to buy me one or you happen to have one so I can get a look at that page, please do so, I'd appreciate it. The Superman story in that issue begins with this legend: "Friend of the helpless and oppressed is Superman, a man possessing the strength of a dozen Samsons, lifting and rending gigantic weights, vaulting over skyscrapers, racing a bullet, possessing a skin impenetrable to even steel are his physical assets, used in his one-man battle against evil and injustice." That story, by creators Siegel and Schuster, is about gambling. Superman comes upon another would-be suicide, a man who is wandering about the woods looking for a good tree to hang himself from. "I've got to save him whether he wants me to or not," Superman says. He does so. The man's not grateful at first. "In heaven's name, what are you?" Superman replies, "Someone who thinks life is too precious to be destroyed." And so that aspect of the character has been there right from the beginning. Well, this fella had his reasons. "You shouldn't have stopped me from destroying my worthless life. I'm a thief. I've stolen money from my trusting employer." Superman tells him to return the money, but the man can't. I've lost every cent of it at the gambling tables." Superman does succeed in talking the guy out of topping himself, but he's still troubled by the problem of gambling. When, as mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent, he fails to convince the authorities to crack down on illegal gambling in Metropolis, he decides to act as Superman. He busts up a crooked casino, tearing up its fixed roulette wheel, then robs the safe and plays Robin Hood by taking the casino's winnings and dumping them on, and I quote, "the impoverished people who do appreciate it." He then scares a problem gambler straight by threatening him physically and also takes on the numbers racket, which, holy moly, was a big part of organized crime at that time and pretty dangerous to mess with. Fortunately for Siegel and Schuster, Dutch Schultz had been dead for about 4 years by then. There's a baseball connection there too. It was the numbers racket that financed a good chunk of the Negro leagues. Finally, Superman trashes every underground casino he can find and reforms the police department by outing the corrupt commissioner who had been bribed to look the other way and tricks what's left of the gambling mobsters into leaving town. Superman threatens to hurt or kill people quite a bit in this story, which wouldn't happen the same way today when his humanism is even more centered. How Casey Stengel felt about all that, I'm not certain. I don't know if he even ever saw the issue. Moldoff hit Red Roughing that November. He only had one 200-inning season left after Moldoff got done with him, and at that point I suppose the authorities intervened and prevented him from assassinating any more ball players in the funny books. He did have a very long career in comics and drew a ton of Batman pages ghosting for Bob Kane, which meant he only put the dynamic duo in danger and left the guys in the dugout alone. In short, go see the Superman movie because he's a true icon of some American values we could stand to be reminded of just now, but don't make up, up, and away your mantra if you're hoping to have a long career playing ball in the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 338 in an ongoing series. I am Stephen Goldman, your convivial and now pretty well-rested host, on our mission to better understand the present via a journey to the past, the time machine being, as it so often is, baseball. One other thing about Shelley Moldoff, he was a key early artist on Hawkman, but I'll be damned if he had ever looked up what a bird's wings actually looked like. He was good in other ways, but his wings are weirdly shapeless, furry things, more like two gray capes coming out of Hawkman's shoulder blades. You could look it up, as Casey Stengel would have said. Thank you for permitting me last week off for the July 4th holiday. No one filed a complaint with HR or anything, and I greatly appreciate it, and I thank you for returning this week. On this episode, I have a couple of things for you. First, after a break, I want to replay something that I said in this week's reissue episode. As you know, during the reissues, I've been doing about 10 to 20 minutes of new material, and since I'm not planning researched baseball stories for that the way that I do them here, I'm just talking about whatever's on my mind, and I've felt free to be a little more extemporaneous and talk a little bit more about whatever is on my mind at that time. And this week, I was struggling very hard with the current political or governmental situation. It scares me a lot. And it feels like the negation, I've said this to you many times before, of the values with which many of us were raised, not necessarily by our folks, although I'm sure that for many or most of us, our folks played a big part as well. But I'm also talking about what we learned as American citizens, as school kids, as just absorbing what the place was about from the culture during our lives. It feels like that's all gone now, and that a certain segment of our fellow citizens are cheering for that. And so it seemed to me, given the way I was feeling and what I was seeing, that it was a good time to make a good statement of my values or infinite inning values. And baseball has informed a great deal of that. Normally, I would just let it live over there, but I wanted to share it with all of you, and I know from the listenership figures that not everyone who listens to the new episodes goes back for the old ones, even if I am doing some new introductions. After that, I imagine it will be time for one more break, and then I want to get into the life of Billy Hunter, a player, coach, and manager who passed away actually on July 4th. And similarly to the reissue episodes, he's someone who I wrote about. I gave him an entry in Baseball's Brief Lives, the Infinite Inning book. And once again, I know that I have more listeners than I do readers of that book. And so I thought that it would not be cheating anyone to just do that passage here on the show as a tribute to Hunter, because I find him wonderful in that his major league playing career, which lasted from 1953 through 1958 on some really important teams, rates by Baseball Reference as being worth negative 1.9 wins, 1.9 wins below replacement, and yet there's still so much to say about him. Very briefly, this week at Baseball Prospectus, I wrote about a favorite team of my youth, the 1984 Tigers. That's the last time the Tigers won the championship. They seem to have as good a chance as anyone of winning the whole thing this year. I also talked about some culture of that time and some figures, whether Walter Mondale or Duran Duran or the really sort of unsatisfying, disturbing Nick Nolte film Teachers. As always, I hope you'll check that out and tell him that Steve sent you. For now, though, the requirements of commerce are sending us pell-mell into a break. So once again, on the other side, a passage from this week's reissue episode, reissue number 10, and then beyond that, the Billy Hunter story. had already planned to reissue this particular episode before Elon Musk had trained his Twitter AI to spew out Nazi talking points. And I feel like this is something that I need to address because there were a lot of people cheering on the revelation that the opposite of woke is Nazi. Think about it. What is an antonym for empathy? Or sympathy for that matter? Well, unsympathetic. That's a word that's in everyday conversation. I am unsympathetic. Meaning, I don't care about your problems. And no doubt there are times when that is a called for attitude. See, the trap that I fall into is that you can't generalize about anything. But I'm thinking of an occasion in which some person takes, say, and I'll do this just to be satirical or parodic about it, this is an extreme example, takes the public position that everyone should be entitled to carry guns everywhere at all times, and in fact shoot anyone who they disagree with, and then they get shot. Then I would be unsympathetic. But when you're talking about some sort of systemic injustice as opposed to tempted fate and found out, then we're in a problematic area of discourse. Years ago on this show, I told a story about a player who used the N-word, and although it was repulsive to me, I said that word as part of the story because I felt that the impact of the story required it. And then I listened to a discussion by an African-American professor of English talking about Huckleberry Finn and why she did not choose to allow that word, which is prolific in that book, to be used in her classroom, even though it is part of the text. And I realized I was very wrong. And if I can inarticulately sum up her point of view, we all know what the word is. It doesn't need saying. We can simply allude to it. We are all responsible for cleaning up our own spaces and not making them any worse than they have to be. And it is such a loaded and painful and ugly word for so many people. So why would you want to introduce it into your own environment, which is probably bad enough as it is in so many ways? Or to put it another way, be sensitive to the feelings of those around you, even or especially when you really feel like you should say something that's going to cause them pain. Does this occasion really rise to the threshold of hurting someone else? Now, I imagine that what I just said rises to the level of woke for a lot of people, whatever that word means at this point. But like I said, the opposite of unsympathetic or unempathetic is woke. That term has been successfully demonized, and yet so much of this country's foundation, the thing that made it different, however imperfectly, was situated in woke. What do you call, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, but really basic wokeness? The statement was so broad as to not disinclude anyone. Abraham Lincoln noticed that in a letter to one of his close friends, Josh Speed, in 1855. He said, "Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it as all men are created equal except Negroes. Soon it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes, and foreigners, and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy." Well, even back then, there would have been people who said, "You're woke, Abe. Screw those folks. This is a white Christian man's country." Thing is, it isn't, and it wasn't. And the moment that people who don't meet that description are here, you have to decide how much of an asshole you're going to be to keep it or return it to the way that you think it should have been in those pre-lapsarian times, which again, it never was. If you've listened to the Infinite Inning for long enough, you know that the idea that all people deserve to be treated with equal dignity and have equal rights under the law, whatever they look like, whatever their gender, their sexuality, their religion, is key to the values that I try to express on this program through the stories I tell. When I started, I was under the impression that the majority of my fellow Americans, and thus the majority of my listeners, would, along with me, hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I don't get bored of saying it. I hope you don't get bored of listening to it. I was wrong. And because I was wrong about that, I never stated it as a set of principles for which I was consistently arguing and insisting that baseball had taught us again and again over its long history. So for the record, I believe that America belongs to all Americans, and you define Americans as who makes up the population of America at any given time. Yes, it was founded by one group of people, and that group of people included in it not just white male landholders, but women, free blacks, Catholics, Christians of all denominations, Jews, Native Americans who had stuck around the colonized areas, and probably, at least to some extent, every other flavor of humanity then on the planet. And yes, it was only white male landholders and slaveholders in Philadelphia, whether as part of the Continental Congress that declared independence or the later Constitutional Convention. But even then, the country was so much more than that. Remember, New York was a port. Boston was a port. New Orleans, which would be part of the national territory soon enough, was a port. People were coming in and out all the time, and some of them stuck. And whereas the Founding Fathers didn't specifically include everybody, as Abraham Lincoln pointed out, they didn't specifically disinclude them either. America was made up of those who were in America. And to invoke Lincoln again, to the extent that all men are created equal seemed hypocritical or not true, he said, duh, it's something we were supposed to work towards. And this is really important because if America is not an ethnicity but a set of values, then inclusion requires not a skin color or a place of origin, but subscribing to those values, which is a question of education. By another rather disturbing coincidence, yesterday, as I record these words, the Vice President of the United States gave a speech in which he disagreed with this definition of America as being defined by a set of principles rather than the more traditionally nationalistic idea of blood and soil. Identifying America just with agreeing with the principles, let's say, of the Declaration of Independence, he said, that's a definition that is way over-inclusive and under-inclusive at the same time. It was over-inclusive, he said, because it would let in anyone who agrees with the principles, which, yeah, and would disinclude some hypothetical person whose ancestor fought in the Revolution or Civil War and yet disagreed with the idea that all men are created equal. He referred to the idea of America as a system of beliefs as either, I've seen it reported a couple of different ways, either a Creole nation, which is just pure racism. Times columnist Jamel Bowie translated it or paraphrased it as mongrel, or he might have said creedle, which kind of makes more sense in context, but I don't know. I wouldn't put anything past that fella. I've always found paranoia about the ethnic mix of America and white Americans' fears of losing their majority very strange, because it seems to me that if you're worried about maintaining American values, first we need to agree on what those values are, and then teach them to everyone, our own children and newcomers, powerfully, emphatically, and make being conversant with them at a high level a condition of gaining citizenship. We can't do anything about our own rotten historical education system, but we can certainly help newcomers in that regard. The alternative, building walls and keeping people out, doesn't do anything to perpetuate our values. It degrades them, and it does nothing to teach them to those who we do let in, or in fact to ourselves. We should say all men are created equal. That means you too, bub, Mr. Newcomer, and anyone you happen to meet. You should have the expectation of equal treatment under the law and from everyone around you, and then we walk the walk. Further, I believe that society should be meritocratic, like baseball is today, now that the color line is gone, which means that a person should advance based on their abilities and performance, not on what they look like or who their parents were. That said, I do believe that the history of the United States has been one of racism applied in certain times and places to a changing cast of outgroups, whether it's the Irish 150 years ago, or the Chinese and Japanese in California during the 19th and early 20th centuries, or blacks pretty much everywhere at any time. When you look at how federal housing authorities, this is just one example, consistently redline black neighborhoods, helping to immiserate them, I don't see how that's anything other than systemic racism at work. I do believe that sometimes fixes are necessary, although that's a very complicated issue, advantaging one group while not disadvantaging another, and vice versa. However, in the long run, when you look at us not as individuals but as a nation, every one of us is a financial or intellectual actor for the welfare of this country, and the more of us who are equipped to contribute, the better the country will be, and that always requires people being able to live in a way that they are not in fear of poverty or dispossession. I do not believe there is a scientific basis for racism. There are minor variations among all people, and some have different gifts than others, but no person or group can be described as inferior. I believe that all human beings have value, and once they are here on the planet, they should have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As an example of refusing to generalize about people, I do not infer that because Johnny Bench was a better player than Johnny Roseborough, that whites are superior to blacks. Nor do I believe that because Roy Campanella was a better player than Joe Girardi, that blacks are superior to whites either. Bench and Campanella were better than the players I paired them with, but that's all you can read into it. The same way you wouldn't read anything into comparing two white players or two black players. Lou Gehrig was better than, Johnny Sturm, who replaced him down the line. Rickey Henderson was better than Vince Coleman. What does that tell you that you can extrapolate? Not a bloody thing. These differences are situational at the individual level, so you might as well forget about them. Further, on the subject of generalization, every group you can think of, whether you collect people on the basis of race, religion, gender, sexuality, or philately, you're going to find some exemplars who are a credit to that group and some who are an embarrassment to it. Humans are like that. Me, I love them all and disdain them all in equal measure until they show me who they are. But even then, that person, for good or ill, is only one of the group in question. The rest of us, as the Jefferson Airplane sang, we can be together. Or to put all of that another way, baseball repudiates racism. Baseball repudiates the idea that we can't live together for what is a 25 or 26 man roster, but a melting pot. I said earlier that the opposite of woke is Nazi, and the opposite of Nazi is baseball. That's all I've got for this. That concludes the excerpt from reissue episode number 10. I hope you didn't mind that. If you had already heard it, I hope you were not too bored with it. And for everyone, I hope you understand that going back to day one of this program in 2017, the thesis was that you cannot disentangle America as a whole from its national pastime. We are baseball, baseball is us, and we are also this other thing that we are living through right now. Like it or not, and some of you like it. But it's all intertwined, and you cannot appreciate the game except on the most superficial level without also understanding that it inherently repudiates a lot of this nonsense. And then once you're kicking back at nonsense, you may as well keep going. And folks, I am exhausted with this. I'm looking right now at a screen from a press conference earlier today where our president was asked if sufficient warning had gone out to those children and families who died in the Texas flooding. The New York Times today had a photo essay that had pictures and a paragraph apiece on as many people who died in that flooding as they could find. A lot of them were 8-year-old girls. They were really from every age group, but there were a lot of children, whether little girls or high school students or even college kids. There have been stories about how that county had been given funds by the federal government under Obama and Biden to build a better warning system, but they refused that money on an ideological basis. But put that aside. Forget fault, forget blame. Over 120 people are dead at last check. Did they get sufficient warning? Obviously not. Definitionally, sufficient warning would have meant that they are still alive. Now, if you gave a damn, if you had some humility, if you had some empathy, if you cared, then you could argue back, look, it's a tragedy, but even if we had had a perfect warning system, there was just no time. It happened too quickly. But that's not what the president said. What he said was, I think everyone did an incredible job under the circumstances. And I don't know who you are, but only a bad person would ask a question like that. Only an evil person would ask a question like that. Me, I do have questions about a camp where a bunch of little girls were parked right on a flooding river, but even if that had not been the case or there was no fault or blame to be attached there either, I imagine many family members are asking these kinds of questions. That would amount to hundreds of people if there's at least one loved one looking back and wishing that some of those 100+ people were still here. And so I guess that's hundreds of people who are now both grieving and, in the president's mind, evil. Oh well, you know the old saying, if this be evil, let us make the most of it. Who said that originally? Surely not infielder, manager, and coach Billy Hunter, who passed away on Independence Day at the age of 97. We'll perambulate a bit through his story right after this brief intermission. So once again, when Billy Hunter passed, I didn't hear a whole lot of chatter about him, despite the fact that he had a really fascinating baseball career, and I thought I would make up for that here. To set the stage statistically, he played in 630 Major League games, spanning from 1953 to 1958, and hit .219, with a .264 on-base percentage and a .294 slugging percentage, which, according to Baseball Reference, Park and League adjusted, works out to a 53 OPS plus. That is to say, he was 47% worse than the average major league hitter in his career. He did not offer sufficient compensation for his bat with his glove, and so, once again, Baseball Reference credits him, if that's the word, with negative 1.9 wins above replacement. Here's the story. As longtime shortstop Phil Rizzuto began to slip in the 1950s, the Yankees took their time finding a long-term replacement. Hunter, whom they acquired in a 17-player trade with the Baltimore Orioles, and depending on your source, we might still be waiting for one player to be named later to be revealed, got a shot at the job, but only for a moment. The Yankees had too many good infielders to play a pure glove man, and this glove man twice led the American League in errors. "He's a showboat," said an anonymous Yankees coach in March 1955, "who makes the easy ones look hard and vice versa." Ray Ordonez was a better hitter than Hunter. Mark Belanger was a much better hitter. Due to an out-of-character hot streak in May of his rookie year, Hunter made the AL All-Star team along with fellow St. Louis Brown Satchel Paige. Hunter had already stopped hitting. As of the All-Star game itself, he was averaging .245, .283, .281. It would be an exaggeration to say that he didn't make another hit all year, but it's close. Over the rest of the season, he hit .189, .218, .234 in 68 games. Casey Stengel once said, "I don't like them fellas who drive in 2 runs and let in 3, but he also didn't care much for players who saved 2 runs but stranded 3. Hunter can go to his left and to his right. He has a strong arm. That leaves hitting, and if Billy can boost his batting average, he'll have to be considered as a starter." That was Stengel's spring training assessment. Hunter couldn't boost his average, of course. Stengel's way of coping was to pinch hit for him early and often. In 1955, Hunter started 91 games. He finished only 50 of them. On 2 occasions, Stengel pinch hit for him as early as the 3rd inning. In one game, the Yankees were trailing 6-4, and Hunter came up with 2 men on. In the other, they were ahead 5-0, and Hunter came up with the bases loaded. Stengel went to first baseman Eddie Robinson both times. In the former game, Robinson failed to plate the runners and the Yankees went on to lose. But in the latter, Robinson hit a 2-run single to turn the game into a blowout. Overall, the tactic didn't really work. Despite Stengel using 3 future Hall of Famers to hit for Hunter, Rizzuto, Mickey Mantle, and Enos Slaughter, as well as excellent players such as Robinson 12 times, Moose Skowron, Joe Collins, Bob Cerv, Ellie Howard, and Hank Bauer, Hunter pinch hitters averaged .147 with a double, 3 walks, and 9 RBIs in 39 plate appearances. After all of that, the Yankees sent Hunter down to the Denver Bears of the American Association, and it's tempting to think that, if the pinch hitters had come through just a few more times, he might have stayed on the roster for the entire season. The Yankees, in first place since late May, had slumped in July, and the White Sox passed them at the end of the month. All of the infielders were slumping, including Hunter. He went 0 for 17 with a walk in the 9 games before his demotion. With Jerry Coleman returning from a broken collarbone, Billy Martin coming back from the Army, young Bobby Richardson playing well at Denver, and Rizzuto still on the roster, the middle infield was where they had the depth to make a change. Stengel, who had earlier praised Hunter for having spark and fight, said of the demotion, "It wasn't something I wanted to do. This boy didn't play bad ball around here. We were in first place with him playing shortstop, weren't we? About 2 weeks later, Hunter broke his leg sliding into second base, ending his season. Hunter spent 14 years coaching for the Orioles. He was the third base coach for almost all of the good years in team history, 1964 through 1977. He turned down opportunities to manage the A's, Twins, and the Reds, but accepted the invitation to be the fourth Rangers manager of 1977 after Eddie Stanky abruptly resigned just one game into his reign. Hunter was the Rangers' fourth manager in a week when he took over, and their sixth manager in the 6 years since the team had moved from Washington, D.C. to Texas. Owner Brad Corbett offered the job to Harmon Killebrew and Don Drysdale and waited for them to reject it before hiring Hunter on the recommendation of general manager Eddie Robinson, the same Robinson who had repeatedly pinch hit for Hunter almost a quarter of a century earlier. "I think Billy is the type of guy who will jerk the players up if they need it," Robinson said. The team, loaded with veterans on long-term contracts, took off under Hunter, just 34-35, and in fourth place in the AL West when Hunter was hired. The Rangers went 60-33, that's a .645 winning percentage, the rest of the way, and finished second. "We were a team that was waiting to have some kind of direction or guidance," catcher Jim Sundberg said. "It was kind of like a rebellious child who needed some leadership. He gave it to us." Hunter returned in 1978, and despite the team's frenetic roster overhaul during the offseason, had another strong year by the standards of the 1970s Rangers, going 87-75. Corbett offered him various long-term contracts, but Hunter preferred to go year to year. His wife didn't want to relocate from Maryland to Texas, so he wanted the flexibility to get out if he needed to. This was used against him when it turned out that not every player wanted to be, in Robinson's words, jerked up. Hunter was an old-school baseball man with a disciplinarian mindset who, quote, seldom showed more personality than a resin bag. Frank Robinson had nicknamed him Little Hitler during their Orioles days. "Gee, thanks, Frank." When Hunter banned the Rangers from drinking in the team hotel and on team flights, it aggravated the club's 30-something contingent. In May 1978, erratic or free-spirited, depending on your point of view, pitcher Doc Ellis vocally challenged the manager on a team bus ride. Hunter responded eloquently, telling Ellis to sit down and shut up. Ellis's response was that Hunter may be Hitler, but he's not going to make a lampshade out of me. Corbett told Hunter that Ellis would be traded, but Ellis outlasted Hunter in Arlington, and there is a bittersweet coda. According to Ellis, he confronted Hunter at a Rangers old-timers event years later. Said Ellis, "I scared all the old-timers. I said, 'All right, you sons of bitches, shut up. I've got something to say. Go out there and bring in Billy Hunter's ass.' They brought him in there. I said, 'Man, let me tell you something. During the time you were my manager, I was a sick son of a bitch. I was an alcoholic dope fiend. In the process of recovery, I need to make amends to you.' It blew his mind." That came much too late to save Hunter's job. Corbett said, "We had a bitter team and needed a manager who can communicate," and fired him on the season's penultimate day. When there were no consequences for Ellis, Sundberg said, "Maybe because Hunter's hands were tied, he let Doc get away with it, and he lost the team." Then and there, Hunter forswore all future Major League employment. He subsequently spent nearly 20 years as the baseball coach and athletic director for Towson University. He turned down all chances to reconsider his vow and return to the majors. "I felt I had accomplished what I set out to accomplish," he said in 2013. Hunter was developed by the Branch Rickey-era Dodgers, but was traded to the Browns before ever reaching Brooklyn. "Everyone in AAA for the Dodgers knew more about fundamentals than the Browns," he later told John Eisenberg. That was almost certainly not hyperbole, and it's easy to imagine Hunter, who also played on 2 Yankees pennant winners and coached an Orioles team that did everything right, developing the belief that he knew more about how to play the game than most. He may even have been right, but acquiring the knowledge is one test, communicating it to others is a harder crucible. Then, as I did with most chapters in the book, I ended with a couple of quotations. Sometimes I wonder myself whether I am doing the right thing by sending them home. Sometimes I wonder if I shouldn't stop them. One thing for sure, the fans in the stands are very helpful. That was Billy Hunter, Orioles third base coach, 1972. And this, from the Dallas Morning News, October 2nd, 1978, right as he had been fired. Was he sorry he ever accepted the Rangers job? Yes, was the reply. If you like what you just heard, there are 99 more stories like that in the book, some of them about players less well-known than Billy Hunter, and some, of course, who are in the Hall of Fame. You can find them in Baseball's Brief Lives by me and available from Amazon and other booksellers. I am also available on social media, and you can find me at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me. There's me again, I'm such an egotist, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there's a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning. Bang! You're there. As always, this show is made possible by its advertisers and its Patreon supporters. And should you wish to support the show, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. I thank you very much. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. It helps the show gain attention. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, like I said at the outset, go watch the Superman movie. I think you'll enjoy it. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, if you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review. I think the Rick-O-Matic is broken. He's repeating stuff we've already done. Well, if I can just get my mom to safety pin this towel around my neck and then I don't break my legs, quote-unquote, flying off of the stairs, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.